Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me for another series of messages, weekly messages. We call them our morning devotionals. And today we're going to continue our look into 1 Timothy in the 6th chapter. And where we left off last time is that Paul said that it was important for us to understand that godliness with contentment was great gain. You remember his concern is some people thought, he said, some believe that being godly is a way to gain stuff, when he says actually godliness brings contentment, not gain, and as a result, the real gain is the contentment itself. In other words, you can be the richest person in the world, but if you don't have peace in your heart, if you can't put your head in a pillow and sleep through the night without worrying about what's going to happen to all that you've accumulated in your short season upon this planet, well, that's more of a torment and a torture rather than something that brings peace. And that's really, I think, what we refer to oftentimes as the money trap. The Bible speaks a lot about secret traps that are set, and David often wrote in the Psalms about his enemies setting traps at various places. And most of us pretty well understand with the idea of how that people in the wilderness oftentimes will set traps to capture animals, to eat and devour them. And that's the image that the Scriptures really transfers directly over to the interaction that we as human beings have with the dark and demonic spirits in the world. That C.S. Lewis very interestingly, very humorously, really kind of described Satan as being basically a cannibal, how that he likes to eat his victims, he likes to break their bones with his teeth. It's the idea that, as Peter talked about, that our enemy is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And so the idea is, in order to devour us, he has to oftentimes entrap us, because he doesn't have any authority over us when we are walking in the ways of the Lord. But if he can get us off the track of righteousness and begin to get us going down paths of iniquity and wickedness and disobedience and transgression, then sooner or later he's going to have in front of us, and we're going to step right into a trap that will entangle our lives in ways that we never thought possible, and certainly in ways that we know that we can't extricate ourselves without Christ's miraculous intervention. And thankfully, when we cry out to the Lord, he does intervene. But it's so sad when you see how this happens. In fact, in ministry, I've seen it happen to many, many people I know, many of my friends and peers. And I just can simply say, I'm thankful that I've never been entangled in something like that would disqualify me and destroy my ministry. But at the same time, we can never have an attitude of self-confidence. In other words, I wouldn't do that and I wouldn't let that happen. I think that sometimes when people make statements like saying, I would never do that, and I don't know how somebody could allow that to happen, you're really kind of daring the enemy to find ways to entangle you. I realize that I am what I am by the grace of God. And every time I've escaped a situation that could have been really a pickle, it was because God was looking out for me, not because I was so sharp or brilliant. And many times I find even literally times where I almost was killed in various circumstances, I almost lost my life. And my escape was purely divine and miraculous. It wasn't because I was quick on my feet. In fact, many times as the danger passed me by, I was as shocked as anybody would have been in that moment, not having seen it coming and not having done anything to escape it, but just simply, I think many times there was an angel that was standing between me and whatever that object or obstacle or device was, that he protected me and he kept me from being overtaken. One friend I knew who was robbed in his store, out in the Virgin Islands of all places, but he had a store there and he was being held up, and the man who was holding him up pulled the trigger on the gun as it was up against his head to kill him, and the gun jammed. And nothing happened. The man ran out of the store, but he fully intended to murder this friend of mine. And having seen stuff like that, you realize that he said he had a dream the following night of an angel of the Lord with his finger down the barrel and keeping it from being able to fire. And whether you accept or believe that or not, I think that that's really the kind of stuff that God does on a far more common basis than you and I would ever realize. But the danger Paul was talking about here is he says that when we don't find our contentment in godliness, we start looking for it someplace else. And that's usually money. And we have this belief system that that money is the secret to happiness. And our culture is all down about that, more so probably than any other culture on the planet, except maybe, I know in Russia I found that to be very true as well, that many people simply believe that money was the secret to a good life, a happy life, that material abundance was the thing that made you feel happy and fulfilled. Unfortunately or fortunately, most people never get the opportunity to be so satiated with material goods that they weary of them. And yet I will tell you that at my age, I've found that there were certain things that my wife and I never would have imagined that we would ever have. We never imagined we would have a home, much less a nice home or nice cars that were reliable. Those kind of things, any kind of savings at all, or any kind of retirement. Well, we never imagined that we could ever have that would ever come to pass. And as we look back on it and realize that God has been faithful to do all of those things for us, all we can simply say is that because we focused our eyes on Jesus, he was faithful to meet us at each step of the way and take care of us. Because even when you try to contemplate things like, how much money would I need for retirement? Well, nobody knows, because nobody knows how long you're going to be around, and nobody knows how long people are going to live after you who are dependent upon your income. I know for me that I pretty much expect that I will leave this world before my wife, but I have no guarantee of that. It just seems like that's kind of the history of our families and the genetic makeup. Her family's existence on the planet is always much longer than my family was, and we were long livers. But be that as it may, we don't really know. And so one of the things that Solomon said in Proverbs is that you want to store up for your descendants. You want them to be able to have that inheritance, that it says a good and a godly man does that. He makes provision. And I say especially those of us who are men who have wives who are dependent upon our incomes for their survival, we want to do whatever we can to store up money so that they're cared for when we're no longer here to do that, or no longer capable to do that. But that's something very different than the concern that Paul has here. His concern isn't people who want to make sure that their family's needs are met. He's concerned about people who have bought into a very faulty belief system that gain is the secret thing, and then you seek God in order to gain materially. As we look at much of what's displayed on Christian television and other forms of media today, we see a lot of these carnival barkers out there claiming that they have miraculous powers and you need to send them your gifts and contributions. And the number of spiritual leaders who have been overtaken by financial and monetary abuse is pretty staggering. It seems like it kind of goes hand in hand with sexual abuse along with economic abuse, financial abuse. Because as I've said before you ever touch those things, you have to touch something else, and you have to be willing to touch the glory of God. That when you're no longer submitting yourself to God and living in the fear of God, then you get a kind of emboldeness to touch and take things that are not for you. So one of the things I think that if you find that you have a habit of greed, in other words, you're attracted to that, you kind of think about money a lot, you worry about money a lot, you worry about how you're going to be taking care of your future, and so forth. And I'm not saying that's altogether wrong, but it becomes an unhealthy amount of worry, where it's creating anxiety, which is basically a low level of fear. And you're kind of living in fear that you're not going to be able to provide for yourself all your days. You have to understand that can oftentimes metastasize into greed. And greed is a bad habit more than anything else. And it's based, again, upon a faulty belief system that money is the key to your future. One of the things that Jesus said in the Gospels, quoting from the book of Deuteronomy, he said, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." So it is God who provides for us. It's God who supplies our needs, and he's the one that we need to look to. And it's important in verse 7, where we're reading in 1 Timothy, he says, following up the statement, "Godliness with contentment is great gain," he says, "For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it." And then he adds, "But if we can have food and clothing, we will be content with that." We might throw in there saying, obviously, shelter was a part of that. I think clothing falls under the context of clothing, of shelter, or clothing shelter, yeah. But the bottom line is that he said, basically, as long as our needs are met, as long as we have food on our table a day, we have clothes on our body, we have a covering over our head, we should learn to be content with that. Well, out of time. And so I'll pick this up on the other side as we continue talking about the whole money trap dynamic that often overtakes people's lives.